listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk.
Number 342.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Station and the second part of the two-part interview with Jasper Winn, the author of Paddle, A Long Way Around Ireland. As I mentioned last time, we do have an executive producer who is supporting this series, and that is Alan Callow from Aberdeen. If you wish to become an executive producer, then pop along to the Outdoor Station website, have a look at the support page, and it tells you all about it. Well, in part one, Jasper told us about the trip and how it all started and began. We now pick up where the story left off last time and continue in Jasper's own style.
According to the Nautical Almanacs, I should contact the Coast Preventative Man to announce my arrival in Northern Ireland from the Republic. But it sounds Moonfleetish, like the excise men, and I decided to smuggle myself along the coast instead. After all, it's not that I don't have things to concern myself with, notably the sweep of waters coming out of Loch Foyle. The huge expanse of the loch's waters are expelled out to sea through a narrow channel between McGilligan Point and Inishowen Head. And in a kayak, these sheets of sliding sea feel like driving a car on black ice. Evening seems to come early. Paddling throughout the afternoon, empty-minded, listening to music, I note it getting dark and chillier around 4. By the time I pass Port Stewart and off Port Rush, dusk has come down. I've done one of my longest mileages, and leaving aside the Loch Foyle turbulence, the coastline I've looked in on has been low-lying and sheltered. I'm in a different place now. And Port Rush, as I come in closer, looks different to me as well. More English, if you will, I think, even as I wonder if that's really the case, or whether I'm just trying to identify a difference. I look in from the sea at a low bulwark of rock, and then a strip of very green grass, and above that a parking lot, backed by a row of 4-storey houses, Edwardian, I think, or maybe later, with big, heavy-built bow windows and important-looking doors. Their colours are muted whites, creams, duck egg blues. Oddly, the cars parked out front are like those of Ireland, the Republic, a decade earlier. Only the occasional new Jeep or this year's top-of-the-range saloon. A lone cabriolet. Every other set of wheels is a modest, often elderly, sensible car. The kind that in Boomtown, Ireland, has been scrapped or given to student offspring to drive. Whilst everyone else, it seems, has upgraded to muscly off-roaders, sports cars, or spacious executive saloons. Beyond the town, there are miles of sand beach, backed by peaked and rolling dunes. I'd got used to the almost empty beaches of Ireland, but here the sands are dotted with evening strollers, dog walkers, late picnicking families, joggers ploughing through the dry sands. I'd intended to camp in the dunes and land the kayak on the beach, but with the surf dumping onto it, I reconsider. From out at sea, waves curling over and running onto the sand can look like no more than ripples with a bit of white tracery along their tops. But they're easily misjudged, and you can find yourself, especially with a fully laden canoe, coming in fast and then crash landing your craft from 5 or 6 feet up in the air. Even quite small waves like this can twist a kayak around and roll it over and leave you crawling ashore in a scatter of possessions turned to flotsam. I don't have a chance of landing here. Once again, I'm fenced out at sea, and I have to keep going. There are cliffs again, and in the gloom, I can't see any landing places until the Hollywood B-movie silhouette of Dunluce Castle rears up on a craggy black headland. It feels like I've paddled into Transylvania. Above me, the MacDonald clan's towers and ramparts crown a forbidding stack of rock, joined to the mainland by a narrow bridge. I land on a jumble of rocks at the castle's foot. A scattering of gulls flutter off rock ledges and fly around in dark, crepuscular bat shapes. On the shores above the broken spars, plastic debris, and old barrels of the tide line, there's no flat space for the tent. I have to make do with a pitch of grass-covered boulders. As I look up, it's clear that the cliff face and the castle itself are in the process of erosion. In the 17th century, a large chunk of the head, supporting the kitchen wing of the castle, had collapsed into the sea, taking that night's supper and most of the kitchen staff with it. In a less dramatic way, a similar fate befalls me. After landing, I drop the food back into the water as I unpack the kayak and my fresh stores, bread, oatmeal, onion, and a packet of biscuits are soaked. Ill-fed and with a bed of rocks, sleep evades me, and I'm relieved to welcome the dawn and get back on the water.
Let's move on to some of your horse riding trips, or give us a bit of an idea on that score. Because certainly Rose and I have found that when we've looked at the horse riding leisure market, or as well as the travelling market, there seems to be very little acceptance of technology, new materials, new styles of things, sort of a lightweight approach, and it doesn't seem to have touched the horse market at all. I wonder if there's any reason for that.
That's a really interesting one, that, because I was brought up with horses in West Cork. It's one thing I sort of say without even thinking. It's one thing I really do know about, just because I was brought up with horses from before I could walk. My mother bought a Shetland pony to add to her herd, so she didn't have to push me around in a pram. So there's a picture of me in a basket saddle at whatever it was, 9 months old, and riding before I could walk. So that was something that was unconsciously part of my life until 16. And I'd ridden really very seriously, and almost as a job, and like sort of shoving kids up chimneys in Dickensian times. I was just put on horses and ponies all the time, so 7-8 hours a day, exercising and mucking out and breaking horses and schooling them and the whole thing. 16 years old, I nipped off with a guitar, didn't look at a horse for 10 years. I was never going to have anything to do with horses ever again in my life. I was going to become a rock and roll star, or failing that, an adventure racing legend. And I was walking this time around in the Sahara, on the 8 Bamran Mountains, right down the Atlantic coast. So from the Atlantic coast across the 8 Bamran into the edge of the pre-Sahara. And I was slogging it over this huge, great rucksack full of water and stuff I didn't need, and the 7 books. And there was this woman who popped up on a mule coming back from market somewhere. And she stopped, and she gave me the biggest dressing down ever. She thought I was the stupidest person she'd ever come across, and she indicated she'd met a lot of stupid people in her life. This was all done in her case, very good, but in my case, very poor Arabic. But what came across was she was saying, look, you're a Westerner, you're an Arumi. Why are you walking carrying stuff? Why don't you buy yourself a horse or a donkey or a mule? And I thought, well, I don't do that kind of thing. Walk for another 100 miles. And every step I thought, this is stupid. And I suddenly realized, actually, I do know about horses. I went back to the coast and I bought a Barb stallion. And it was my first horse trip. And that was so different from everything I'd done before. I had to completely relearn everything I knew about horses. The way that things are done in Morocco is different from the way they're done in Spain. It's different from the way they're done in England or Ireland. So everything that I'd been taught and had drummed into me about horses was wrong. And that was a great thing to learn so early on. So I rode the horse from Marrakesh to Fez, all through the mountains. Great trip. As I thought, okay, this is what I like doing. I like doing horse trips. And so suddenly it kind of slotted back in. And that's really what I've done as background, as my main thing for the last, 20 years now, is really studying, researching traditional horsemanship around the world. And to get back to your question, everybody who deals with horses is effectively doing the same thing, but with subtle differences. And they all think that the people next door have no idea how to do anything with horses. If you talk to somebody in England, they think that everything to do with Spanish horses is wrong. The bits are wrong, the saddles are wrong, they ride them in the wrong way, they water them after feeding or before feeding, or they don't make them do this, they do make them do that, they don't group. Then you go to the Spanish guys, and they think the English don't know anything about horses. They think it's an absolute miracle we have any horses alive at all, because we obviously don't know anything about horses in Ireland or in England. Then you go but it's all the same tradition. It's all the same 6,000 years of experimentation, and then finally getting it right. Basics haven't changed because it was all looked into many, 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 many hundreds of years ago, millennia ago. When people used to steer horses, as you can see, not cave paintings, but what do you call it? Rock engravings of people steering horses 4,000 years ago using a stick either side of the neck. So you tap it on one side and the horse goes one way, you tap it on the other side and it goes the other way, and you bash it across the nose and it stops. And I see people in Morocco still doing that with mules and donkeys. But somebody came along and went, hang on a second, well, we use a bit. If we put this thing in the horse's mouth, we could actually stop it accurately, we could steer it accurately. Nobody's really improved on that. You can have hackamores without the bit, but it's still the same idea. It works on the same principle. Saddle, likewise. Apart from the side saddle, and as somebody pointed out, if the world was logical, men would ride side saddle. Apart from the side saddle, it's all the basic same system. You need stirrups to steady yourself with. You need the saddle to protect the horse from the weight. You need to do this. You need to do that. They're different if you want to jump. They're different if you want to go rounding up cattle because you need the horn to tie things onto. So my interest became in traveling the world and seeing what people did everywhere, and then trying to kind of collate out of that some kind of well, I suppose really sort of overview of horsemanship, both in time and space. And that is really what I do most seriously. I mean, paddle was just a typo. It should have been called saddle, and I should have ridden around Ireland. So the horsemanship thing is interesting. And I'm constantly asking the kind of question you do. Why do people do this? Why haven't they adapted this? Now, there actually is a lot of use of new materials and, different kinds of saddles using new materials. On the whole, they just don't really seem to work very well. I mean, leather, on the whole, does seem to be the best thing to have around horses. And the saddle is pretty much going to be like it is. It's got to keep the weight off the actual spine itself. But I actually have a real interest in very basic, simple horsemanship. So a lot of the stuff I do now is bareback and with almost no kit at all. Because kit on horses is, doing long-distance trips with trying to carry stuff on horses is just a pain. It takes away nearly everything that's fun about a horse. You can't trot or canter if you've got too much kit on board because it rubs the horse or it bounces up and down. You can't go so far if you've got lots of kit because you're tiring the horse out. So ideally, I like to learn from people who work with horses all the time, and that's again a bit like the endurance, the adventure racers who just want to do things as fast as possible. And the people who live the life. I like learning from people who work with horses all the time, whether they're cowboys or vaqueros or gauchos, whether they're horse herders in Central Asia, because these people really know how to get the best out of the horse and out of themselves. And what is almost universal is people who spend all their time with horses rarely carry much stuff. They wear their stuff.
But coming back to that, you initially were talking about the trips you made yourself from Marrakesh, and looking at well, as you say, everybody's lifestyle's changed, how access has changed. Certainly, the idea of doing a long trip on horseback in the UK is probably virtually impossible unless you're lucky enough to be up in Scotland. And reading the book there, you were touching on the fact that in Ireland, wild camping and a wild lifestyle is sort of illegal, should we say, technically illegal, because access is fairly constrained and restricted. And certainly around a large section of the world generally, New Zealand, for example, there is no such thing as right to roam and freedom of paths and whatever else. Do you think that travelling by horseback is actually become, travelling by horseback as opposed to horse riding and going back to the same place you started off from, has become sort of virtually an impossible thing to do for most people?
It hasn't become impossible. The Long Riders Guild, which is a sort of wonderful overarching umbrella organisation run by Basher and Cucullin in America, has stories from the road of, at this point, tens, even hundreds of people out doing amazing long trips. What they're nearly all finding is that it's not the horsemanship that's so difficult anymore. It's just, as you say, the access. It's getting from one place to another. Crossing borders with horses, almost impossible nowadays, especially coming from sort of major areas, bringing horses from Central Asia into Europe. I mean, it's costly, almost impossible in some cases, will require quarantine or huge amounts of bribery. Similarly, you can't bring horses up from Africa. You can't cross horses easily from one country to another in South America. These things were all much easier to do 30 and 40 years ago. Even in the time that I've been going to Patagonia, which is since the late 1990s, I've done a lot of long distance riding there in different ways. It's become more and more difficult. Even places that you'd have had, it's a grace and favour thing. It's the way that we've always worked in Ireland. You know, if you want to go walking up a hill in Ireland, you don't have any right to it. It's owned by somebody. But sure, if you want to do it, that's fair enough. You must be mad, but off you go. That's all changed now because more and more people want to do that kind of thing. And it's the same in Patagonia. At one point, it would have been traditional just to allow people to ride across your land because they had to get from one place to another. And if you own, 50,000 hectares in the middle of that route, then obviously people have to go across your land. Now, more and more, there are fences going up. So last year when I was guiding on a trip from we started off in the Pacific, we took 12 paying clients, one wonderful woman called Jane Williams and myself with her horses. We took 12 paying clients from the coast of Chile, the Pacific coast, up over the Cordillera, up over the Andes, and then right across Patagonia, 900 kilometers to get to the Atlantic coast. The horsemanship, getting that many horses across, was difficult enough. It was like invading a small country with cavalry. But the real difficulty was the amount of time Jane had to put in beforehand talking to estancieros, people who owned large tracts of land, and negotiating for access. Now, when she first came there 30 years before, when I first was in Patagonia 12 years ago, that would have been a no-brainer. You just have rocked up, opened a gate, ridden on through, probably a gaucho to come out and go, hola, ¿qué pasa? Oh, yeah, bueno, ¿qué pasa? Now you've got to renegotiate that. You've got to unlock gate. Some people will just say, no, I'm not having you on my land. And that's becoming truer and truer all over the world. I think for whoever we are, it was maybe the attraction of kayaking around Ireland was that in Ireland, that's the last great frontier, the last place where you can just go and do a road trip, ironically, is on the sea. And how long that'll last, I don't know. I think it's the same. It's obviously the same in England. England, in fact, in many ways, for riding, is probably better off. I think with some planning, you probably could do a long-distance ride using bridleways in England that would be very rewarding. Because that's something we don't have in Ireland, any extensive bridleways. It's either paved roads or private land on the whole. Whereas here, amazingly, my sister works over here with horses. And the first time I came to visit her years ago in Sussex, I said, well, where do I ride? And she said, well, you can go down that track there, and then there's 18 miles before, with no roadwork at all. It's all just interlinked bridleways. Amazing, revelation to me. But then compare and contrast that with Sweden, which is a country I love hugely, for its amazing wilderness, and the fact that you have the all man's right, the right to roam and to camp anywhere where you're not causing a nuisance to somebody else.
So it's certainly something to be celebrated, and by the sound of even that description you've just made, that these opportunities are slowly eroding, which is a great shame. I did remember reading in the Long Riders Guild, one of the random pieces I picked up somewhere. Rose was saying that I think there was a Swiss girl that rode all across mainland Europe, no problem at all, had a great time. People were wonderful. The network of tracks, whatever they're called, through France was fantastic, and she intended to go to Scotland, and she crossed over at Dover, and within 2 or 3 days she decided to turn back because she found the access to the bridleways and bridleways generally, and the roads were just too dangerous, and people weren't giving way, as it were. But also, I suppose, our bridleway network has been mashed up with the local authorities stopping and starting them at places where there's a junction between authorities and it goes bridle. There are sections around here where we are in the heart of England where there is a mile of bridleway, and the access to it is only footpaths, so you can't actually get to it to use it as a bridleway. It's just completely bizarre, but that's life.
But you're very accurate. Just a quick point on that, because I walked the Ridgeway last year, And I was looking at it from a rider's point of view, and exactly what you said was there were stretches of the bridle of the ridgeway which have horse access, but then it goes for 2 miles and stops with no way off, and then it opens up again as a bridle way, 4 miles further on. And that is, I mean, literally lack of joined up thinking there is just odd.
Yeah, but exactly as you say, landowners with influence wanting to limit access to footpaths and then putting up various obstacles en route, which they're entitled to do to protect their livestock, I guess. But
and I think what the underlying thing, which I've realised, I mean, Sweden has this amazing wilderness, this amazing freedom to roam. Sweden is, I think it's the same size as Germany, not far off it. Population of Sweden, 9 million. And that means that essentially it's one of the least populated areas in Europe. But effectively, of those 9 million, probably 5 or 6 million of them are right down in the south, in Stockholm and Göteborg. So when you go up into Jomtland and those places, there's virtually nobody there. You can afford to have a kind of, roam wherever you like policy when you don't have that many people. And I think this is a big problem with Ireland, England, Belgium, Holland, all these places which one might wish to roam around. There's just too many people for that kind of thing. Strangford Lough is another great body of water that expels itself on the ebb tide. If Loch Foyle had seemed like a mouth spurting water out, the local name for the entrance to Strangford, Squeeze Gut, suggests something more explosively bowel-like. A sailor had told me of having his yacht stopped dead and thrown into the air by 8 knots of outrushing tide. Not a great place to get caught in the wrong conditions in a kayak, he'd emphasised. So it's a welcome anticlimax to slip across the loch mouth in almost still waters. The coast is peaceful here, or it is until a distant mosquito whine rises to a sound like a chainsaw as 2 jet skis come into view. I always think of jet skiers as embittered souls, driven to their antisocial hooning by the realization that they've been fooled into buying a piece of expensive motorized nonsense with all the thrills of a ride on lawnmower. I escaped the noise by diving into a narrow channel just before Ardglass. The channel opens out into a sun-warmed pool, and I hang over the side of the kayak looking down as if into an aquarium, watching gobies and blennies fluttering through the spinneys of seaweed. There's a handy slab of rock, and as a bit of a luxury, I step out to stretch my legs and take a piss into the water. I've hardly got back into the kayak when there's a huge flurry in the water, and a seal is swimming up the channel, nostrils whiffling. She, I'm assuming it's a she, hauls out onto a flat ledge a few yards from where I'm floating and arches back her body, head up, eyes closed. Every few seconds she snuffles her nose back into the water for an ecstatic smell, scented, I presume, by my own pheromones. I'm intrigued by this display when I catch sight of a big bull seal surging up the channel, blocking off my exit. He's a very big seal, mottle-coloured and heavy-headed, with only a lack of legs differentiating him from an actual land bull. I'm concerned that he sees me as a rival. He doesn't look happy, and I imagine him as a shaven-headed yob. "Oi, you, looking at my bird? Yeah, you." I try to exude genuine innocence. "Oh, her? No, hadn't even noticed. Very attractive, I'm sure, but not my type. Look, you two are happy together, the two of you. Don't want to disturb now. If you just maybe move over a little bit, I could squeeze by, but just leave the two of you." The bull sinks down into the water. I can see his huge bulk a few feet down. Miss Seal is blowing flirty little bubbles out of her mouth at me. She's also hooked her back flippers up onto a ledge out of the water and is crossing them and uncrossing them. She slips back into the water and wiggles, as much as an animal the dimensions of a hippopotamus can be said to wiggle towards the kayak. The bull resurfaces too, putting the 3 of us each at one point of a small equilateral triangle. Flattering as the lynx effect of my uride on the seal cowl is proving, surely it must have diluted to nothing by now. "Go to him," I will the blousy slapper seal, as she undulates through the water, away from the bull seal and towards me. "Go to him," I tell her. "We have no future." The bull is only a few feet away from the kayak now, rising up high above the water. The cow is on the other side of me. I can see a hard glittering in the he-seal's eye. And suddenly, the fear that had gripped me as I contemplated just how much damage an angered and jealous bull seal might do to me as a rival fades away, to be replaced by a far, far worse horror. Dear Christ, no, not a threesome. Seeing a gap in the channel, I make my excuses.
The actual book itself, you sort of roughly sort of gloss over the sort of equipment that you took, but I think by your own admittance, it wasn't the top of the range. It wasn't the most expensive, but it was, as you've already described, something that was close to you and practical and did the job and so on. But I suppose you see a lot of hikers, you see a lot of backpackers, world travellers, and possibly horse riders as well. That when they arrive at a destination, they're very, very concerned about the security of their equipment or their possessions, whatever it might be. But it's something that you actually is not mentioned in any shape or form, virtually, and throughout the whole book, about being concerned about when you sort of get fed up on certain days and dump the kayak and shove the stuff in the bag somewhere, and you wander to find a hostel or find a pub. You never seem to have any concerns about sort of general security. And is that true for the whole of Ireland, do you think, or is it just sort of just the way that I'm looking at it?
No, and I think Ireland is, on the whole, a secure country. I mean, it's a polite country. It's still a very rural country, especially around the coast. So I wouldn't have worried unduly about leaving the kayak up on a little quay somewhere. And who would be going there other than fishermen? And they'd have more to lose than I would. They leave all their stuff piled up down there. And I have to say, there were elements of it. There was a bit where I was stuck for 3 days of high winds and torrential rain in Easkey on the coast of Sligo on the south side of Donegal Bay. And I had a little Saunders Jetpacker tent. It's a great bit of kit, but to be quite honest, 3 days pinned down was pushing it a bit. So I walked off, left this whole load of kit, the tent, all the contents, and the canoe out on a remote headland. But there were roads going past it. And I sat in a pub in Easkey, and I thought, you know what? If somebody wants to steal the whole lot, I would help them pack it up and put it into the back of the car. I'm so tired of this trip. I was very happy for anybody. They could have come along, they could have taken my whole load of kit, packed it into the canoe, and kept canoeing themselves. I wouldn't have cared. But I mean, I suppose everybody who travels, who is listening to this, knows that you have gradients of kit. And I always have a little grab bag with me of stuff that I don't want to lose. My diaries, my notebooks, stuff that's important to me, and that goes with me wherever. I mean, I may have left all the rest of the kit and everything's in a ditch next to a little remote bay somewhere, but that grab bag just goes with me wherever I go. And I think most people do that. They have stuff that really is important to them. You just don't want to have too much stuff that's important to you. Otherwise, you become sort of your own janitor, always looking after your own stuff and worrying about it too much. And that's a horrifying handicap in life, having to worry about stuff. It's bad enough having to worry about people.
You touched on sort of fairly sensitively the difference of going from Southern Ireland into Northern Ireland and then back round down the East Coast. Give us a flavour of the sort of the local characteristics that you found coming from your start point right down at the tip there of Southern Ireland and coming up to I suppose the Belfast area, the tip there. Just how things changed, because you sort of described the fact that you absorbed the accents and adjusted your accent to suit and make your passages as easy as possible.
It wasn't quite that calculating. It's actually, I was brought up in Ireland, but with English, half English, Irish parents. And I suppose I've always been very aware of accent within Ireland because it's a great telltale. One becomes very sensitive to that. I mean, I can hear an accent and place it not just to whether it's northern or southern, but probably whether it's a Galway accent or certainly I can find a Dublin accent, no problem at all. Or even just areas of Cork, I would hear the difference in because that's what we've all been schooled in unconsciously. So I think it's actually much more about my awareness of it than any great changes going around the coast. I think also the trip, Well, going up into the north, I was going up into an area of Ireland I didn't know that well. I worked in Belfast for a while, many years ago, and I've been to Donegal. Uh, but I started off from West Cork, and that I know well. I was amongst friends. I would be in pubs, even quite remote pubs, far away from Cork, in Kerry, say, or up in Kerry. I was still up in Clare. I would still meet people who, if they didn't know me directly, would know somebody. We do that classic Irish thing of, talking to somebody and going, "Where are you from?" "Ah, okay. You don't know so-and-so, do you?" "Oh, you don't? Oh, I thought it might be your cousin." "Right, yeah. Oh, they're grand, yeah." And that ceased to work for me the further up the coast I got, up the west coast. So as a Mayo, wasn't meeting nearly as many people as who knew people who knew people who knew people I knew at all. The degrees of separation are increasing. So it kind of gave me that feeling of being more out of home waters as I went up. And then the northern accent is quite strong, and it changes hugely in what was the longest single passage I did, which was across Donegal Bay. So I went from sort of Sligo and the west of Ireland into the north, and in that sort of what I think is 8 hours of paddling to get across the bay, popped up, and it was as if I'd gone to a completely different area. So, woke up the next morning and everybody was speaking quite differently, and it's not a big thing, obviously, but it's a bit like kind of, I think, if you did the same thing in England or in France, you suddenly realize, okay, I've come to a different place, a different area. There are different ways of talking about things and describing things. But then going across the border, the actual political border, there was one big change. I come up the west coast. It's very rugged. You get this huge Atlantic swell. I mean, probably apart from the coast of Norway and the coast of Scotland, it's probably the most rugged coast in Europe. So I got up to Malin Head, which is the most northerly point of Ireland, went round that, and then crossed the border into Northern Ireland. And the thing that changed was the National Trust. I was suddenly in National Trust land, because the coast of Ireland, of the Republic, is fairly sort of remote and unmediated. And there's the Cliffs of Moher. That's got a bit of a fence on it to stop people falling off the edge. But the rest of it is pretty wild and rugged. And suddenly you come around the corner and it's all sort of manicured and all National Trust. So you've got the Giant's Causeway. It's got a nice little cafe and some loos next to it. Car parks all over the place. Lots of signs telling one what to do. It's quite strange. That was the thing that obviously struck me as most different. The fact that the coastline was suddenly much more mediated. Nonetheless beautiful. I mean, the coast of Antrim, when people ask me, what's my favourite, perhaps because least known to me, that the coast of Antrim, the Glens of Antrim, from the sea they're like Narnia, and they are like Narnia, because C.S. Lewis, who was from Belfast, to a great extent wrote about the Mourne Mountains and Antrim in creating Narnia. And that's very much, you expect to see unicorns galloping around the place rather than Frisian cows. And also, the coast changed for me because I was a lot fitter. And just to kind of put the whole thing into perspective, it's 1,000 miles around Ireland, which it's 1,000 miles because you're avoiding touching Ireland as much as possible by cutting across from one peninsula to the next, across bays, across headlands. It's a bit of a slog up the west coast because certainly in my case I was unfit, the weather was bad, I was unsure what I was doing. Got round Malin, I was a lot fitter, and you got these amazing currents. And I'd finally learnt how to use the currents and the tides. And so I was picking up 5 and 6 knot currents, whisking me along. It's like being a suitcase on a luggage carousel at an airport. Even if I just sat there eating biscuits and looking at seagulls, I was going forward. If I paddled as well, I could be pushing myself up to 8 knots. So that's more than 8 miles an hour. And then I just, okay, the tides change, the currents change. I'll just stop for 6 hours and let it change under me again. So that coast too sped by me a little bit. It was sort of, like some being in a car, just looking out the window, kind of go, whoops, there goes the north, there goes Fairhead, there goes Antrim, there goes Belfast. So the truth of the trip is, I think it's very telling, is it took me 2.5 months to do the first 500 miles around Ireland. It took me 2.5 weeks to do the last 500 miles.
What was the overall change that you recognised in yourself in doing the trip and in completing the trip?
Gosh, you are the one with the telling question, aren't you? Do you know? I think the truth is, it was absolutely no change at all. I think there had been changes whilst I was doing the trip, but at the very end, the very end was very, very low key. I got to where I'd started from and could easily have kept going for another week, another couple of months. In fact, the very last day, I could have knocked the trip off. And I thought, actually, back in home waters, I'll go to sleep out on Rabbit Island, and a place I know quite well. And just it felt very normal at the end, just to have spent that much time traveling slowly. And I think maybe that's the difference between, slow adventure and setting oneself a real challenge. It was all about the traveling. There was no real end to the trip to aim towards. I was quite glad to complete it. I would have been disappointed if, for some reason, I hadn't got the whole way around. But it was much more about the experience and the traveling and the doing it than anything at the end. I mean, nobody knew, very few people knew I actually went on the trip, and nobody knew that I was about to arrive at the end. And you've read the book, but quite genuinely, I got to the end, got to the spit of gravel where I'd started off from at Reen, pulled the kayak out, pulled all these bags of kit out, and called a taxi from Skibbereen. And this guy came out, and we're now into sort of mid-September, and it's been the most awful summer. It's been windy and wet, and been gales day after day after day. It was a gorgeous day. It was one of those lovely crystal clear autumnal days, blue skies, sea sparkling. And the taxi driver bumped his way down, put all the bags in the back, and we're driving back into town. And so he said, what kind of day do you have out there? And I said, it's a lovely day. And he said, did you come from the Glandore side, or did you come from the Baltimore side? That's the bay to one side and the bay to the other. I said, no, I left from Reen and I came back to Reen. And he went, oh God, just a lovely morning trip. Well, aren't you very lucky? Because every other day of this summer was absolute shite.
And that concludes this two-part interview with Jasper Winn, author of Paddle, A Long Way Around Ireland. My thanks to Jasper for taking the time to join me. Incidentally, all the music you hear on this podcast has been produced and played by Jasper himself. The book is published by Profile Books, and there's a direct link to purchase it on the Outdoor Station webpage. I'm Bob Cartwright, and the executive producer for this two-part series has been Alan Callow. Until next time, folks, just remember, all who wander are not lost. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear more from our extensive free library, please visit the website at theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
You can now follow The Outdoor Station on Facebook, where we chat about each programme we produce, answer questions and discuss future productions. Why not join us there?
This podcast is produced and hosted by theoutdoorstation.co.uk.